Franco wanted to participate in World War II on the side of his wartime sugar daddies, Hitler and Mussolini. A widely held Francoist myth, even among people who are not fans of the dictator, is that Franco was cleverly prudent, finding a way to ask for everything while giving nothing, stalling for time and heroically resisting the threats of Adolf Hitler, then the master of Europe, to save Spain and the Spanish people from the horrors of war. This is how Francoist propaganda framed it at the time. For instance, the newspaper ABC wrote on May 8, 1945, as the war in Europe came to an end, quote, "The caudillo seems chosen by God's benevolence. When everything was uncertain, he saw clearly and from a distance, upholding and defending Spain's neutrality against the most varied suggestions, against both covert and outright pressure." End quote. Funnily enough, in this narrative, Francoists conveniently forget to mention the horrors that Franco and his allies inflicted during the civil war they initiated, as well as the ongoing bloody political repression after the war ended. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and today I will explain the real reasons why Spain did not formally join the war, neither on the Axis side nor with the Allies. And no, the answer isn't just Spain was devastated after its civil war. I'm going to present irrefutable evidence to dismantle the Francoist myth surrounding this issue, drawing from contemporary Spanish, German, Italian, British, and Portuguese sources. If you have a friend or relative who believes Franco saved Spain from the misfortunes of World War II, send them this video. And for those too lazy to watch it all, the recap of reasons is at the end. Let's begin. To understand the Franco dictatorship's stance in World War II, we shouldn't start by looking at the outbreak of the war or the famous Hendaye meeting with Hitler, but rather at the Spanish Civil War. Due to the crucial intervention of Italy and Germany in that conflict, these two powers had Franco by the balls. Thus, on November 28, 1936, Italy signed a secret agreement with his rebel government stating, quote, "If either of the two contracting states enters into conflict with one or more powers other than themselves, or if military, economic, or financial measures are taken against either of them, the other commits to adopting a stance of favorable neutrality, providing access to essential materials and granting the greatest possible facilities for the use of ports, air routes, railways, and roads, as well as for commercial relations through indirect channels." End quote. On March 20th, 1937, Franco signed a similar bilateral agreement with Nazi Germany, quote, "In the event that either country is attacked by a third power, the government of the other country will avoid anything that could serve as an advantage to the attacker or a disadvantage to the attacked." End quote. So beyond ideological affinity, the Francoist government was bound by written agreements to a neutrality in name only, that involved close collaboration with Germany and Italy. On a more personal level, it's worth noting that Franco had a deep admiration for Mussolini, who he saw as a mentor. In July 1939, during a meeting with the Italian foreign minister, Franco emphasized that the Axis powers could count on Spain's most friendly neutrality. Notably, Spain signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in March 1939 and withdrew from the League of Nations in May, aligning itself with fascist nations seeking to reshape the world order. Franco and the Spanish nationalists who won the war wanted Spain to rise again as an empire and be seen as a great power alongside Germany and Italy. Make Spain great again. Sounds familiar? Franco was convinced that Spain's rise was unstoppable, just like his own military and political ascent. According to the Portuguese ambassador, the caudillo was intoxicated by his totalitarian power. Quote, "I see him obsessed with state power and personal power. Among all the people in the Spanish government, he is the one who tells me the strangest things and speaks the language closest to the Axis." End quote. Franco began to believe his own propaganda, that he had been chosen by God to save Spain. When the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany following the invasion of Poland in September 1939, the Spanish military leadership met to prepare for a general mobilization, draft military plans, and develop a rearmament strategy to gain independence and make the nationalists' Imperial wet dreams a reality. Plans for a new war fleet and aircraft were as ambitious as they were unrealistic, given Spain's economic and technical limitations and the lack of interest from Germany and Italy to share their technologies. As for military plans, they were offensive in nature and all targeted France and the United Kingdom. These were not normal plans concerned with the country's defense in anticipation of various scenarios. They specifically aimed to conquer Gibraltar, French Morocco, and bomb southern France. That's why they built fortifications and deployed artillery in the Strait of Gibraltar, the Pyrenees, and the Balearic Islands, in case the Allies attempted an invasion. This aggressive militarism began months before France's unexpected defeat, and it occurred without any pressure from Hitler. This serves as proof of the Francoist regime's own imperial ambitions and debunks the claim that Franco only opened his eyes and considered entering the war after France fell. The Spanish nationalists of the time saw France and the United Kingdom as the countries responsible for Spain's international subordination and as decadent false democracies controlled by Jews, Freemasons, and leftists in general. These military plans for conquest and war required significant funding, which led to Spain's disastrous economic situation. It is true that Spain's GDP fell by 20% as a consequence of the civil war started by the right-wing traitors. Francoist propaganda blamed the Reds, the leftists, for prolonging the war and depleting the country's gold reserves. But what were they supposed to do? Let themselves be slaughtered without resisting? What was not normal was that there were 2 decades of post-war hardship for a 3-year conflict, with an extremely slow economic recovery, mainly due to the regime's ideology. Military spending consumed more than 40% of the Spanish state budget during World War II. The Spanish rearmament program and the maintenance of an army of over 500,000 men after the Civil War show that Franco's government prioritized imperial projects and military waste over economic reconstruction through productive industries. Instead of wasting money like Franco did, you can put yours to good use by becoming a Patreon of the show at patreon.com/newhistoryspain in exchange for juicy benefits, or you can make a one-time donation. Links are in the description. But back to the topic, it was purely political decisions that led to the imprisonment and placement of declared enemies of Spain, really enemies of fascism, in concentration camps, as well as forcing thousands of Spaniards, including some of the country's greatest minds, into exile. Franco could have chosen a policy of forgiveness, but he didn't. Between 1939 and 1942, Spain suffered a famine that killed at least 200,000 people, a direct result of the economic and agricultural policies of a totalitarian regime. The famine could have been avoided if Spain had ceased aiding the Axis, as the United States and the United Kingdom had offered food on the condition of neutrality. It could have been avoided if Franco's dictatorship had not rejected numerous Anglo-American loans for ideological reasons. The famine could have been avoided by not drastically increasing food exports to Nazi Germany to please Hitler and pay off war debts. According to the British ambassador, the entire potato harvest from Valencia was purchased by Germany. Large quantities of tomatoes and fruit also ended up in the Third Reich, all while Spaniards were starving, especially in prisons and concentration camps housing the regime's enemies. Due to his autarkic ideas, Franco dismissed liberal economic plans for controlling inflation, foreign trade, and attracting foreign investments. Plans that existed long before the famous 1959 stabilization plan. In other words, Francisco Franco is to blame for Spain's misery and economic stagnation in the 1940s and 1950s. The fact that one of the most enduring Francoist myths is that Spain owes its economic growth to him is one of the biggest historical falsehoods ever. Therefore, let me emphasize once again, Spain's economic situation during World War II was absolutely dire, not due to divine will or the climate, but rather due to the regime's fascist policies, even more so than the devastation caused by the Civil War. But delving into the chronology of events, France's rapid defeat between May and June 1940 took everyone by surprise, as the French military was regarded as one of the best in the world. On June 12th, Spain shifted from neutrality to non-belligerency at the suggestion of the Italian dictator. This was a concept invented by Mussolini, not recognized in international law, which served to appease Italy and the Falange, the Spanish fascist party, while signaling a pseudo-neutrality favorable to the Axis and a state of readiness to enter the war. 2 days later, Spain occupied Tangier, a Moroccan city that was under a special international administration. Suddenly, euphoria and imperialist dreams ran wild within Franco's inner circle and his media. Franco believed it was the moment to reclaim a prominent role for Spain in a new world order. The caudillo instructed the chief of the general staff, Juan Vigón, to deliver a letter to the Führer on June 16th. Among other things, Franco wrote, quote, "Dear Führer, at this moment when the German armies under your command are leading the greatest battle in history to a victorious conclusion, I wish to express my admiration and enthusiasm, as well as that of my people, who observe with deep emotion the glorious course of a struggle they consider their own. I do not need to assure you how great my desire is not to remain on the sidelines, and how satisfying it will be for me to offer you, at any time, the services you deem most valuable." End quote. We know that he conveyed Spain's territorial claims over the entirety of Morocco, the Oran region because there were more Spaniards than French in that part of Algeria, along with the expansion of Western Sahara and Spanish Guinea. In later negotiations, the Spanish even requested the return of Roussillon, the former Catalan county taken by the French in the 17th century, but their territorial demands generally remained consistent in the following months. 3 days later, the Spanish ambassador in Berlin presented a memorandum to the Germans stating, quote, "Once France ceases fighting and if England continues, Spain will be willing to enter the war after a short period of preparing public opinion. In this case, it will need some support from Germany in terms of war material, heavy artillery, aircraft to attack Gibraltar, and perhaps the cooperation of German submarines to defend the Canary Islands. Also provisions, ammunition, fuel, and other supplies that could come from French stockpiles." End quote. If it was already undeniable that Franco wanted to join the war on the Axis side, it became even more obvious by mid-1940. And what's funny is that literally no one had asked for his help. This offer to join the war came from the Spanish side, without any pressure from Hitler and without German troops even reaching the Pyrenean border. The caudillo did not make exaggerated territorial demands as an excuse to stay out of the war. He was simply caught up in the euphoria of Nazi victories, let his imagination run wild, and basically wrote a letter to Santa Claus without considering how unrealistic his demands were. On June 17th, Franco mobilized his troops in Morocco to prepare to enter the French-controlled area. However, the action never took place due to fear of failure if they encountered resistance, and because Hitler vetoed it, believing it would complicate his peace negotiations. The Germans responded coldly to Spain's letters through a secretary, merely acknowledging receipt. A true humiliation. At that moment, neither the Soviet Union nor the United States were involved in the war, only the British Empire was holding the line, along with countries that declared neutrality but were later invaded by the fascists. It made sense for Hitler to believe he had already won the war, especially since some sectors of the conservative British government were debating whether to negotiate peace. He had no interest in satisfying Spain's fantasies about North Africa because he had his own colonial plans. Franco, allegedly a military genius, estimated that the UK would endure German air attacks for only 2 or 3 weeks. And yet we are supposed to believe that Franco had a crystal ball and skillfully deceived Hitler into keeping Spain out of a war he supposedly foresaw as a lost cause for the Axis? If Hitler had been interested in Spain joining the war at that moment, there is little doubt that Franco would have eagerly jumped in like an opportunistic scavenger, believing it would be a short conflict. The German ambassador in Spain had the impression in August that Spain's economic situation was not a major concern for the government when it came to deciding whether to join the war, as they believed the UK would not hold out for long. Spain's air minister even told the head of German naval intelligence, Wilhelm Canaris, that Franco considered Spain's swift entry into the war very useful because British trade restrictions were pushing them toward it. From all this, it is clear that the claim that Spain remained neutral due to the devastation of the Spanish Civil War simply does not hold up. As the summer weeks went by and the British Isles put up more resistance to air attacks than expected, some within Germany's high military command proposed taking the fight to the periphery of the British Empire. It was then that Spain's offer to participate in the war started to interest them. This led to Operation Felix, a joint German-Spanish plan to seize Gibraltar and close off the western Mediterranean, thereby cutting off British supply routes from India and other colonies via the Suez Canal. Operation Felix did not involve a German invasion of Spain, but rather a passage of German troops with Franco's consent. Although the Spanish dictator agreed to its planning, Franco actually wanted an entirely Spanish operation to preserve national pride, but relying on Nazi-provided weaponry. The claim that Franco inflated Spain's supply needs in case of war is nothing more than another Francoist myth. In reality, the Minister of Industry and Commerce sent the Germans a reasonable list of demands, but they either considered it excessive or felt their own supply limitations, as they were also struggling with the British naval blockade. Both Franco and the Germans recognized the risks and limitations of Spain abandoning its neutrality. They knew that the Spanish Air Force and Navy were in poor shape, that Spain lacked fuel and ammunition stocks for more than a few days, and that without Axis material support, the Spanish army could only sustain a war effort for a few months at best. They were well aware that the UK and the US would impose economic sanctions, cut off all supplies, and that the British could seize the Canary Islands, Morocco, or even launch an attack from Portugal. In the second half of September 1940, Spain's Minister of the Interior and Franco's brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano Suñé, traveled to meet with Hitler and the German Foreign Minister. Serrano Suñé was the second most powerful man in the dictatorship and a staunch pro-Axis fascist who aimed to become Prime Minister, reducing Franco's power as head of a state. His trip to Berlin was not a mere formality, as Francoist propagandists later claimed. In fact, it was the Nazis who made unacceptable demands during their meeting with Serrano. They proposed exchanging a Spanish Guinea for the entirety of Morocco, and even suggested that Spain cede some Moroccan bases and one of the Canary Islands. The island in question was likely Fuerteventura, as a German citizen with government ties had purchased large tracts of land in the island's southern Hendaye Peninsula, where deep coves provided excellent concealment and resupply points for German submarines. The Führer, driven by insatiable imperial ambitions, considered the UK already defeated. By requesting a Canary Island, he aimed to establish air bases as close as possible to the United States, a power he believed Germany would inevitably confront. As you can imagine, the atmosphere of the meeting was tense. Franco's arrogant brother-in-law expected a warm reception from the Germans, but instead found that they treated Spain as a mere satellite state of the Nazi regime. The gap between both sides was simply too wide. On October 23, 1940, a famous meeting took place in the French border town of Hendaye between Francisco Franco and Adolf Hitler, an event widely praised by Francoist panegyrists as the moment when the caudillo skillfully and prudently resisted Hitler's pressures. In reality, Hitler did not come with any intention of presenting Franco with an ultimatum to force him into the war. The Hendaye meeting must be understood in the context of other discussions the German dictator held with Mussolini, Pétain, and Franco himself to explore whether the territorial interests of Vichy France, Spain, Italy, and Germany could be reconciled. For his part, the Spanish dictator arrived willingly to reach an agreement, not to waste time. Just days before, he had dismissed Foreign Minister Juan Luis Belvedere for being too pro-allies, and replaced him with the most Nazi-leaning figure, Ramon Serrano Suñé. He also replaced the Minister of Industry and Commerce with Demetrio Carceller, a corrupt phalangist who, incidentally, was the grandfather of the man of the same name who has run the Dam Brewery since 1994 and is one of the richest men in Spain. As you can see, many of Spain's current oligarchs are often the children and grandchildren of figures from the Francoist dictatorship. These government changes were a gesture toward the Axis that pleased Mussolini and Hitler, while putting the British on high alert. The day before Hendaye, the British ambassador in Spain met with Franco and Serrano Suñé. He understood that the caudillo believed the collapse of the French front, along with the fact that an oil-rich country like Romania had joined the Axis, meant that the war on the continent was already decided. Franco was confident that German military power would prevail, and with arrogance he told the British ambassador that he had seen a lot of war, and did not believe, as the British claimed, that once the UK gained air superiority, the course of the war would change. What a military genius Franco was! Yet Francoist propagandists dare to claim that Franco stalled Hitler because he knew the Axis was going to lose, when in reality his eyes sparkled with excitement at Hendaye just from being in the Führer's presence. At the Hendaye meeting, Hitler explained that Spain's imperial ambitions in Africa were irreconcilable with those of Vichy France. He stated that supporting Spain's claims would provoke a crisis in relations with Vichy France and could encourage uprisings in the colonies and more support for de Gaulle's movement, as the agreement would inevitably be leaked. For this reason, unlike on many other occasions, Adolf Hitler could not resort to diplomatic deception with false promises. To reach an acceptable stance, the Führer offered Gibraltar but postponed negotiations over colonial territories until the end of the war. The Spanish delegation, in turn, asked for the same territories and supplies as before. The only fruitful outcome of Hendaye was the meeting the following day between Spanish Foreign Minister Serrano Suñé and his German counterpart. In a secret agreement, Spain joined the German-Italian Pact of Steel, which committed the signatory powers to assist each other, thereby abandoning neutrality. However, this agreement was kept secret, and both parties agreed that the decision on when Spain will enter the war will be left to Franco. One clause of the agreement stated, quote, "In fulfillment of its obligations as an ally, Spain will intervene in the current war of the Axis power against England after said powers provide the necessary military support for its preparation, and on a date to be determined in a joint agreement among the three powers, considering the war preparations to be decided." End quote. In other words, in the end, Franco yielded to Hitler's desire to secure a military alliance without having Spain's territorial demands recognized in writing. For the Germans, the Spaniards asked for too much and offered too little. Hitler was disappointed with the caudillo, and German officers called Franco insecure and an ungrateful coward. The Führer even commented to Mussolini that he would rather have 3 teeth pulled than negotiate with Franco again. The truth is that for the moment Spain was more useful to the Germans as a neutral country from which to carry out actions favorable to the Axis while enjoying the benefits of neutrality. Although Franco understood the reasoning, the Spanish dictator was displeased with the lack of commitments, and after the Hendaye meeting, he became more cautious and less enthusiastic about joining the war. As a tantrum over the Hendaye outcome and perhaps to show he was still interested in joining the war, Franco definitively expelled the international administration from Tangier, annexing it to Spanish Morocco. 2 days before Hendaye, a senior official from the Nazi Foreign Ministry wrote in his diary, quote, "Gibraltar is not worth much to us, and whatever England loses with it, it will recover, at least temporarily, by occupying the Canary Islands. Spain is starving and has no gasoline. Even the British might drag Portugal into the conflict and settle in the Azores and Cape Verde. Besides, Spain's adherence to the Tripartite Pact, along with other vassal states, has no practical value whatsoever." End quote. In the second half of 1940, there was a strategic indecision in Berlin about whether to focus on suffocating the British Empire from the periphery or to prepare for the invasion of the Soviet Union. This uncertainty led to German overtures toward Spain. The only period when Hitler seriously pressured the Spanish government to enter the war was between November 1940 and January 1941. On November 19th, Franco's brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano Suñé, visited Hitler at his residence. The Führer wanted to close off the Strait of Gibraltar. However, within less than a month, Spain's difficult economic and supply situation not only failed to improve, but worsened significantly, with famine becoming even more severe. That didn't stop a pro-Nazi fascist like Serrano Suñé from telling the Germans that the economy was not the most important factor in deciding to enter the war. He claimed that joining the conflict would serve to unite the Spanish people, impose discipline, and resolve the ongoing struggle between the military and the Falange, the fascist party. Such statements clearly reflected how detached he was from reality, but they followed a logic of personal benefit to radicalize Spain, strengthen the Falange, and secure his position as prime minister. The majority of the military, clergy, and the Spanish population, however, opposed entering the war. A week before this meeting, Navy Captain Luis Carrero Blanco wrote a report for Franco and the military high command, in which he acknowledged that the British still held considerable military strength, that the war would be prolonged, and that Spain should not join Germany and Italy until they had gained control over the Suez Canal. Carrero Blanco's realistic military analysis quickly made him one of Franco's trusted advisors. Because of this, Franco, through Serrano, conveyed that he wanted the assault on Gibraltar to coincide with what seemed to be the imminent Italian capture of Suez. Hitler hoped to carry out Operation Felix, involving German and Spanish troops, in early January 1941. Serrano merely stated that he will discuss it with Franco, without committing to a date for Spain's entry into the war. But he did express interest in the immediate arrival of German experts to prepare for the operation. However, it was impossible for Spain to join the war at the time. The situation was no longer the same as it had been a few months earlier, when the summer harvests provided a degree of relative economic relief. Everyone, including the Germans, Italians, and British, was well aware of Spain's famine during the winter of 1940. If Spain entered the war, its wheat needs would be much greater than estimated 6 months earlier. Franco himself admitted that Spain would be a burden on the Axis. The Germans saw it the same way, as reflected in a December diary entry from the German Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, following the British counteroffensive that thwarted the Italian conquest of the Suez Canal. Quote, "The truth is that now we are letting all problems rot. Russia, Turkey, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Spain, even France, which is putting on airs. The Spaniards don't want to commit to a date. Spain's disorganization and Franco's incompetence give us the great fortune of not having to carry a cripple on our shoulders." End quote. Hitler's last attempt to get Franco to join the war was in January 1941. He did so through his ambassador in Spain rather than sending a special envoy, which already suggests that either the pressure was not as serious as some Francoist historians have claimed, or that the Führer miscalculated. In no case was there an ultimatum with severe threats, such as a German invasion. In fact, Air Minister Juan Vigón, speaking on behalf of other generals who wanted Spain to remain neutral, made it clear that Spain will offer armed resistance if the Nazis invaded by force. Hitler only briefly considered invading Spain in late 1942, following the Allied invasion of North Africa known as Operation Torch, but Germany's collapse in Stalingrad made launching another offensive on a new front impossible. The German ambassador conveyed to Franco that Spain's immediate entry into the war was the only option of strategic value to them. But the arguments provided by the Germans were unconvincing. They kept repeating that Britain was about to fall and that the British were not helping the Spaniards, while at the same time, German promises of wheat were far inferior to the imports Spain was receiving from countries like Argentina and the United States, which would be blocked if Spain joined the Axis. If he had wanted to, Hitler could have exerted more pressure, but he did not consider Spain a priority since he was already focused on the invasion of the Soviet Union. Franco responded to the ambassador by saying that he did not want to simply reap the rewards of others' victories, but rather to participate in them properly. However, the famine and the repercussions of joining the war in terms of supply shortages made it impossible at the moment. Franco was genuinely hurt that the Germans questioned his sincerity and faith in an Axis victory. He was like, "Come on, Hitler, we're all fascists here." Serrano Suñé reproached the Germans for not sending supplies to prepare for war and for Hitler's refusal to do so until Spain officially declared war. As a result, Hitler decided to definitively cancel Operation Felix to capture Gibraltar on January 28, 1941. In a meeting between Franco, Serrano Suñé, and Mussolini in February 1941, the caudillo made his position clear. Quote, "Spain's entry into the war depends more on Germany than on Spain itself. The sooner Germany sends aid, the sooner Spain will contribute to the global fascist cause." End quote. And yet some still question whether Franco's dictatorship was fascist. Franco also met with Pétain, head of Vichy France. Pétain warned him that the French would resist any attack on their North African possessions. Franco must have realized that his imperial dreams were mere fantasies under those circumstances. We know that between October 1940 and June 1941, Franco and Serrano Suñé would have been content with a private letter from Hitler and Mussolini recognizing Spain's territorial aspirations in Africa. Consider how little they were willing to settle for such weak guarantees. But that letter never came, as Hitler did not want to risk antagonizing Vichy France. An agreement with Germany was never reached because the Nazis never committed to sending food, military supplies, or other resources to Spain. On the contrary, Germany squeezed Spain dry, demanding more exports to keep its war machine running, in line with Nazi ideas of racial superiority and a Europe subordinated to German interests. Essentially, Hitler wanted Franco to join the war without guarantees of supplies or written territorial promises. One of the main reasons for the Axis' defeat in the Second World War was the fascist nature of its regimes. This is evident in how fascist powers attack countries without informing their allies, pursuing their own gains through fait accompli. Even Franco, motivated by Spanish nationalist ambitions to unify the Iberian Peninsula, planned to occupy Portugal. The Axis was incapable of prioritizing cooperation to win the war over the individual imperial ambitions of its fascist states. It was a dysfunctional and uncoordinated union of selfish actors. That said, did Hitler regret not getting Spain to join the war? Fortunately, we know what he thought, as he wrote about it in a letter to his secretary Martin Bormann on February 10, 1945, reflecting on the past when the war was already lost. Quote, "At times, I have wondered whether we did the right thing by not involving Spain in this war in 1940. It would have required little persuasion, as Franco, deep down, wanted nothing more than to count himself among the victors, following the Italian example. Franco, of course, had highly exaggerated ideas about the value of Spanish intervention. However, I believe that despite the systematic sabotage by his Jesuit-like brother-in-law, he would have agreed to join our cause under reasonable conditions. The promise of a small piece of France to appease his pride, and a substantial part of Algeria as real material gain. But since Spain had nothing tangible to contribute, I concluded that its direct intervention was undesirable. It is true that it would have allowed us to seize Gibraltar. On the other hand, Spain's entry into the war would have added many kilometers of coastline we would have had to defend, from San Sebastian to Cádiz. By ensuring the Iberian Peninsula remained neutral, Spain had already provided us with the only service it could offer. A country like Spain, in its state of poverty and unpreparedness, would have been more a liability than an asset." End quote. What advantages did Spain provide to the Axis by formally declaring neutrality? I will only mention the most relevant ones here, as my research on this topic will fill an entire episode in the future. Due to ideological affinity, belief in an Axis victory, and the commitments from the Spanish Civil War that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Franco continued helping Nazi Germany until the very end. Between 1939 and 1942, Spanish authorities were involved in supplying German and Italian submarines, ships, and planes in Spanish ports and airfields, a flagrant violation of neutrality. This was particularly beneficial to Germany, as the limited numbers of submarines meant that resupplying in Spain saved them 2 or 3 weeks of returning to their home bases. Another major service Spain provided to the Axis was intelligence, especially in the Strait of Gibraltar. The Nazis established their largest spy network in a neutral country in Spain, with the Spanish government's complicity, and installed technology to detect ships passing through the strait. Additionally, Germans and Italians carried out sabotage operations from Spanish and Moroccan territory. Germany also obtained supplies through Spain from countries it could not trade with directly. Spain exported pyrite and tungsten to Germany, both of which were essential minerals for military use. Even in 1945, Spanish ships transported supplies to isolated Nazi-resistant pockets in southwestern France. The Francoist myth that Spain was forced to collaborate with the Nazis due to the threat of a German invasion across the Pyrenees does not hold up, since Spain aided the Axis from 1939 to the very end, when there was no longer any threat of invasion. No country was truly neutral in World War II, but of all those claiming neutrality, Spain was the least neutral of them all. Returning briefly to the chronology, even after January 1941, Spain still had opportunities to join the Axis. In May of that year, when Rommel's German offensive seemed capable of conquering the Suez Canal, the Spanish dictator was once again on alert in case Spain could finally enter the war. On April 30th, the Spanish Navy's General Staff issued instructions to all Spanish merchant ships to prepare for a possible entry into the war, advising them to take shelter in Axis ports or in Argentina if they could not return to Spain. Franco was inclined to join the war, but there was internal division within the regime and a certain level of hesitation. In June 1941, Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, giving the United Kingdom a crucial new ally in the war. Franco formed the Blue Division, consisting of approximately 48,000 combatants, mostly Falangist volunteers, to fight against the Soviets. This was both a way to repay Germany and to appease Hitler after the cancellation of Operation Felix. Franco saw the global conflict as three separate wars: the Pacific War, which will begin a few months later between the United States and Japan, the European War between the Allies and the Axis, and the war against Soviet communism. He claimed that Spain was neutral in the first two conflicts, but belligerent in the fight against the Soviet Union, despite never officially declaring war, as Germany had requested. This stance inflamed Falange's already intense anti-communist sentiments. Against this backdrop, Franco delivered a speech on July 17th before the National Council of Falange, which alarmed the Allies. Among other things, he made the following reckless and provocative statements. Quote, "I wish to bring to every corner of Spain the awareness of these moments in which the fate of our nation is tied to that of Europe. Not because I have any doubts about the outcome of the conflict. The die is cast. In our fields, the first battles were fought and won. The destruction of Russian communism is now inevitable. The American continent cannot dream of intervening in Europe without exposing itself to catastrophe. This war has been poorly planned, and the Allies have lost it. The German arms are leading the battle that Europe and Christianity have long yearned for, and the blood of our youth will unite with that of our comrades in the Axis." End quote. Once again, Franco proved he was no military genius and had little ability to predict the future. As a direct consequence of his incendiary speech, the British nearly invaded the Canary Islands, re-examined Gibraltar's defenses, and most significantly, tightened the blockade on Spain to teach the dictator a lesson. Spanish generals formed a committee and tasked General Luis Orgaz with making it clear to Franco that they demanded the dismissal of Serrano Suñé and that he refrained from making any further foreign policy statements without informing them beforehand. The caudillo hit his pants. As historian Nicolas Sesma has analyzed, war is a crucial tool for internal politics. Beyond ideological motives, Hitler and Mussolini went to war to consolidate their leadership, which had initially been granted to them by their respective heads of state and supported by conservatives. In contrast, Franco had come to power through a civil war. This meant that the victors were more aware of how much it had cost them to seize the state and were unwilling to risk losing everything over colonial ambitions. Franco was not suicidal. His top priority was always himself, maintaining his dictatorial power at any cost. And if that required making changes and concessions, he will make them. The final factor to consider in Spain's decision not to enter World War II on the Axis side was the carrot and stick policy employed by the United Kingdom and the United States. The fascist Spain that emerged after the bloodshed of the Civil War was not economically self-sufficient. In fact, it depended on imports for food and oil. The British controlled the seas and used their power, despite protests from neutral countries, to create blacklists of companies and implement the Navy Certs system, which consisted of certificates issued by the British government to confirm that a ship was not carrying any prohibited cargo, thereby avoiding inspections. The UK and the US would either provide economic relief or tighten the valve on overseas trade to suffocate Spain, depending on how Franco behaved in his relations with the Axis. However, they had to be extremely careful in maintaining this delicate balance, because if they pushed Spain into too desperate a situation, or conversely gave too much, they risked driving Franco toward joining the war on the Nazi side. Shortly after the Hendaye meeting, on November 23, 1940, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote the following to the President of the United States, quote, Our accounts show that the situation in Spain is deteriorating and that the peninsula is not far from the starvation point. An offer by you to dole out food month by month, so long as they keep out of the war, might be decisive. Small things do not count now, and this is a time for very plain talk to them. The occupation by Germany of both sides of the straits will be a grievous addition to our naval strain, already severe." End quote. However, British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs Anthony Eden knew that despite the famine, Spain was still sending food to the Nazis. This reinforced his conviction in the effectiveness of the carrot and stick approach. He was right in thinking that if Spain had not been suffering from such hunger and had not been entirely dependent on the Allies for oil, Franco would have been much more likely to bring Spain into World War II. Until 1942, the Allies had to treat the Spanish government carefully, but as the war began turning in their favor, they could exert more pressure without fear of serious consequences. For example, between January and April 1944, they stopped exporting oil, rubber, cotton, and other vital resources to punish Spain for exporting tungsten to Germany. The British were always aware that the determining factor in Franco's decision regarding the war was how the conflict unfolded. If things had gone badly enough for the Allies, he would have joined the Axis regardless of Spain's economic and military conditions. Beyond these conventional diplomatic and economic pressure tactics, the British also employed more creative methods to keep Spain neutral. I'm talking about the multi-million-dollar bribes funneled through Spain's richest man, Juan Marc, to generals and other key figures in Franco's regime, ensuring they supported policies that favored neutrality. I have made a video about this secret British operation on my Spanish channel, and a whole series about the fascinating life of a despicable man like Juan Marc. So if you want me to translate these videos, let me know in the comment section. As a final curiosity, it's worth noting that the Spanish government considered breaking ties with Japan and declaring war on them following the Manila Massacre of February 1945, where many Spaniards were killed. However, this would have been nothing more than a symbolic gesture to gain favor with the United States and improve Spain's chances of joining the United Nations. The Americans, however, showed little interest, and Spain had entered the game far too late to have enough time to send a volunteer army against Japan. So, in no particular order, let's recap the reasons why Spain did not enter World War II. It was a combination of factors, most of which Franco did not control. First, the prolongation of the war thanks to Britain's stubborn resistance during the period of maximum temptation for Franco, from June 1940 to July 1941. Second, Hitler's unwillingness to anger Vichy France or encourage de Gaulle's resistance movement, which prevented him from making false territorial promises to Franco. Third, the Führer had no intention of entering Spain without Franco's permission. Fourth, the Germans' refusal to satisfy not only Spain's territorial demands, but even its requests for food and military supplies. This was because the Nazis saw Spain as a satellite country to be exploited for food and raw materials. Fifth, the lack of a clear strategic direction from the Germans during several months of 1940, until they eventually focused their attention on the Soviet Union. Sixth, the lack of synchronization in the moments when both Franco and Hitler were most interested in Spain entering the war. Seventh, the fortunate fact that Stalin did not declare war on Spain. Eighth, the fact that Spain did not declare war on Japan in 1945, nor side with the Allies in the Pacific. Ninth, the dire economic and military situation of Spain after the Civil War and the famine caused by the disastrous economic and agrarian policies of the totalitarian fascist dictatorship, which made Spain a burden to the Axis. 10th, Spain's dependence on food and fuel supplies transported by sea from the United States, Canada, Argentina, and the United Kingdom. 11th, British bribes to key figures in the regime to support neutrality. 12th, the opposition of most of the army, the clergy, and Spanish public opinion to further wars. And 13th, the fact that Franco was not suicidal and would not risk losing his dictatorial power without forcing a clear Axis victory and without promises of spoils. This set of circumstances prevented Spain from entering the war, which was crucial for the survival of Franco's dictatorship. In reality, Spain's formal neutrality in the Second World War was merely a symptom of its own military and economic weakness at the time, a sign of impotence. However, the desire of key figures of the ruling class was to join the Axis, since they were fascists. Realizing how close he had been to making a mistake and pulling Spain onto the losing side, Franco stopped believing he was unstoppable and became more cautious and began paying more attention to the trusted professionals he surrounded himself with. That's it for today's episode. If you like it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to New History of Spain if you are new, and comment if the information I have shared and the evidence I have presented has changed your mind, your understanding of why Spain did not enter World War II. If you think my work is important, join the community of Patreons at patreon.com/newhistoryspain in exchange for benefits like early access or appearing in the credits. Subscribe so you don't miss new content on Spanish history, and see you next time!